Hey everybody, welcome back to Parkitect. And in this part of the campaign, we're getting quite a few different paths. For one, we have Ice Shelf Islands up here. We can also go to Biscayne Beach, and we could try Batavia Cay. And I think I'm just gonna pick and choose whichever I feel like doing most at any time. And today I want to get into Ice Shelf Islands, because I think it's a good change of pace from all of the tropical scenarios that we have so far. And also, it's the first snowy biome, so that's gonna be interesting. This is actually one of the scenarios which I played the most before the game came out, so I do have some experience with this. But that said, I didn't theme it very well, so this time I'm gonna try and go for some kind of Scandinavian theme. I'm mostly thinking about the surroundings of Gothenburg in Sweden, and see if I can turn this into something. Also, something which I should note, and I haven't pointed out so far, is that the scenario goals have been tweaked since the game came out. So some of the scenarios that I've played might have actually changed in terms of what their objectives are. So yeah, lots of stuff that even I'll be able to see are gonna be slightly different from the way that they were when the game just came out, just because they are balancing it out a little bit based on feedback that players have been giving. In any case, oh god, I said it again. It's not too difficult of a scenario. We have a fair amount of flat rides here. Roller coasters are going to be a bit more tough since we don't have anything yet, or no real standard roller coasters, I suppose, so I'm definitely going to research that. And also the goals on this scenario aren't too difficult. We need to get 550 guests, a happiness rating of 75%, and an experiences rating of 70%. I think the experiences rating is going to be a little bit more challenging, but other than that, nothing too much out of the ordinary here. So yeah, I'm just gonna try and build some rides, build some buildings, and try my first bobsled coaster of the playthrough so far as well. So that should be interesting. Anyway, let's get started. Alright, so I wanted to start off here by the lakeside, just because I didn't really know what to do with the entrance area, and I think really, whenever you feel like you want to build somewhere in the middle of nowhere just because you have the best idea of what to build there, usually it's a good idea to just go ahead and do that and try to hook it up later. At least that's what I tried here, because I didn't really know what I wanted to do with the entrance, but I definitely wanted to build some kind of small town-feeling boulevard next to the water over here. Just because that interaction with the lake I thought would be really neat. And I'm saying lake, but it's probably the sea, since these are islands. And that's also what my inspiration mostly came from. There's an archipelago just off the coast of Gothenburg that I went to last year, which I think looks super nice, super charming. Lots of these little villages with all these Swedish red houses on them, and that's what mostly inspired me to go for the theme of this map. So yeah, one ride over here, and then I'll just build some houses around that, put some of the necessary facilities in, and decorate it all nicely. And for some reason I've been reading up on the history of these houses in Sweden, so if you'll just allow me to go on a bit of a tangent. Basically, I was wondering why so many of the houses in Sweden were red, and I heard a long time ago that there was something about red being a royal color of the king and people wanting to go for that color for that reason. Turns out that's not entirely what it's like. So basically, in a town in Sweden called Falun, I think, there was a copper mine, which was such a huge and old copper mine. It operated for over a millennium, and it basically gave Sweden a monopoly on the copper market, the global one, that is, for a really long time. But one of the byproducts of this copper was used for red paint, and as a result of that, it was super ubiquitous, and people just started using the red paint. Also partly because historically it was used by Swedish people to kind of emulate the look of red brick houses in Europe, so it's more of a sort of aristocratic thing. But once this paint became super available to everybody, everybody started painting their house red. And at that point, the aristocracy, I think, also decided to paint their houses in different colors, like white and yellow. But yeah, that's basically why a lot of houses in Sweden are red. It just kind of turned into a traditional thing, all because it was this one byproduct of mining that they just had lying around anyway, and decided to turn into something. So I thought that was a really interesting history, and I'm definitely gonna try and get as many red houses into this build as well, because as much of a cliche as it might seem, if you go to Sweden you really see red houses and barns and sheds everything in red everywhere. So that's quite interesting, I think. Now, I'm not making every single building red, that would be a bit boring, so here's just one unpainted wooden house as well as a yellow one. Apparently the advantage of painting them red as well, especially compared to not painting your houses at all, is that the paint does give some, you know, defensive mechanisms to the wood, so they don't start to weather as quickly or rot as quickly, so that's probably definitely part of the question as well. It's a theme that I really like for theme parks though, and maybe for similar reasons as an American Western theme, because it's not too expensive to pull off, it's not too difficult, it doesn't require a great level of detail, it's just a lot of wood and very simple materials, but it's really charming, and it's this really nice sort of country style, family owned theme park, I guess counterparts to the Western style theme parks in the US. So when I was traveling across Sweden, I was actually on a road trip to visit different theme parks, and I've noticed that a lot of these, especially family-owned theme parks in Sweden, do follow this very rustic Swedish style. For this, Liseberg was a bit of an example, which has one main street with really cool architecture along the sides, but even some of the smaller parks, like that one park where Tranan is, Skara Sommerland, like there's this really nice, charming Swedish feeling to a lot of the parks, and even if it's not super explicit, it's just this really fun and charming atmosphere, I think. So moving on to the entrance area, I really didn't have much of a clue of what to do with this, so you can probably see that it turned out into a pretty simple entrance area, just trying to get the bare bones of what I needed in here. As well as some wider paths. In general, I try to always keep the paths a bit wider at the entrance, because this is where most of the crowds are going to be, because they haven't really dispersed into the rest of the park yet. And also, you know, the very necessary information kiosk right at the start of the park. This is one of those quirks of Roller Coaster Tycoon that I guess I never really got over. And to be very frank, I think a lot of what I do in this game just kind of comes from my experience in Roller Coaster Tycoon. Sometimes in good ways, I guess, because it has given me a lot of experience with trying to dress up these parks while also keeping an eye out for finances and all of these little neat tricks that I try to use as much as possible when it comes to theming and stuff like that. But in some ways it's also held me back, I guess. Part of that, I guess, is trying to place the information kiosk at the start of the scenario, which I guess isn't too bad, but that's definitely a habit that I had from Roller Coaster Tycoon. But in the last video, somebody also asked why I never really build tunnels, and that's something that I always forget. I didn't really like doing that too much in Roller Coaster Tycoon, because it's really hard to get tunnels in there. I think that's one of the things that this game greatly improves upon. Because you really had to dig out a specific area and get a vertical edge somewhere to move your coaster into. And you don't need to do that in this game, but sort of from that experience, I'm not very used to putting stuff underground. That, and also it's a bit broken. If you do end up putting stuff underground, you can completely cheese these scenarios. And to be very frank, I've actually had some conversations with the devs on this. Because for some of the scenarios, people tend to just make them a lot easier by putting everything underground when the space is limited. So that's also something to work out. But yeah, that's, I guess, the twofold reason. For one, I'm not really used to putting stuff underground, and I also think that, you know, it's a bit more challenging if you try not to build everything underground. So yeah, that's basically that. Maybe I should get up to speed a little bit here. So these two rides I figured worked quite well with this whole sort of hilly area. I really like it when you've got these hilly areas with paths sort of intertwining and these little planters between them. I tried to do that on Adventure Island as well, but I think over here it works out a little bit better. I don't know if it's the path textures or just that they weave a little bit better, but I really like this entrance area so far. Even though it's very simple, I think it gets the feeling of these kinds of theme parks quite well done, I suppose. So this is just about the final parts of the entrance area. I really don't like putting roller coasters right next to the entrance. I think at this point I was kind of noticing a trend here. I actually tried this scenario first, building a bobsled right at the start, right next to the entrance, but that didn't really work out. And for me, the entrance area of the park is something, I don't know, supposed to more just have buildings and flat rides and kind of get you into the theme of the park. And then the roller coasters for me tend to be more towards the back, which I guess in an historical sense also kind of works, because a lot of parks will start off as a more small park with just flat rides and built their roller coasters only when they've expanded a bit. Speaking of roller coasters, it was finally time here to build a bobsled coaster. And what I think is really interesting is that in this game you can build both mech and Intamin bobsleds. So basically this is a mech bobsled because it has a train, but the Intamin bobsleds have like regular typical traditional bobsled carriages, I guess, which is just one car which can seat 6 people, and those things are incredibly rare. The Efteling is gonna close their version later this year, and I think that was the last or second to last bobsled coaster from Intamin in the world, which is kind of a shame because I really like those. I honestly prefer them over the mech versions, because even though these things with the train, they're quite nice, they don't flow quite as well as the traditional bobsled coasters, I think. They just don't tend to go as much back and forth. They're also a little bit less intense, I've noticed, in terms of their drops and hills. But they do have a lot of advantages, one of them being is that they're still being built. There are way more of these in the world, and they're also more efficient, I suppose. Maybe not per se, but if you build an Intamin bobsled, you really have to put block brakes everywhere or the thing is not going to work. And with this bobsled, usually 1 or 2 mid-course brake runs should do the trick. So I decided to go for this one instead. I think it just fits a little bit more into this park. But hopefully one day I can build an Intamin one, because I just really love those things, and I'm super sad that the one in the Efteling is disappearing. Even though it's understandable, because Intamin doesn't really support that model anymore, so I don't think they supply the parts for it anymore, and that basically makes it impossible to have it in any of your parks without ridiculous maintenance costs. Something like that was the situation. In any case, they are replacing it with 2 family coasters, which, coming from the Efteling, I guess that's a good way to fill out the roster of coasters that they have, but it's a bit disappointing to see another family coaster in the Efteling. Anyway, let's catch back up to what I'm doing here. The layout is pretty much finished here, just built on top of this hill. I didn't really know what to do with the hill otherwise, so it's just gonna be this bobsled, and I'll try to have the rest of the park kind of go around it. And then for the station, I was thinking of building just one of these red Swedish barns, but in the end I decided against that, and I'm just building a very generic wooden station with this very kind of standard wooden roof layout. Which isn't the best thing, I suppose, but it at least looks a bit different than the other buildings around it. Which I think is pretty good for a coaster station. You at least want it to stick out a bit and make it clear that this is where the coaster is. And for once, the queue line entrance is actually even next to the building and is pretty visible, so that's probably one of my better queue line placements, even if it is quite a short queue. I think I'll be fine because it's quite efficient. There are 3 trains on this thing, so even though it's 1 person per car, it shouldn't be too inefficient. And finally, here's a carousel, because what's a park without a carousel? Now let's see how the park is doing, and hopefully I can actually make a profit out of this. So, here's our little bobsled coaster, and surprisingly the park is actually making a good amount of profit. I really wasn't expecting it to do this well, but hey, I'm not complaining about that. Also, somebody suggested that I should turn off the UI for these parts, and I think that's a pretty good idea, so here you go. So altogether, I think this ride works quite well. I'm pretty happy with the layout actually. It's really just 2 parts, few helixes here, into a mid-course brake run, which is thankfully well timed with the lift, so I didn't even put much effort into that, so I'm glad that it actually works. And then it's back into the final brake run. I'm actually gonna probably put some catwalks on these brake runs, because I do think they look a bit empty without them. But that's something to get into later. For now, I'm really happy with how it turned out, and I'm also quite happy with how the waterfronts over here turn out. Might put a little bit more decoration in here, but altogether I think it pulls off the simple rustic atmosphere quite well. And I think the entrance area, even if it's not too complicated, just a bunch of paths, I think it does a good job at just being an entrance area. Still need to figure out what I'm going to do with this part of the park, because it's a bit of a dead end and I'm not quite sure what I can turn it into. But if we go over here, there's a lot of space there to work with. And also I think, there we go, I'm getting this steel coaster. That's really cool. I don't have anything else yet. But I can definitely build something with the steel coaster. I don't want to build a wild mouse. I think those work best on flat terrain. And since we have a hilly scenario, I think it would be nice to try and build something kind of terrain conforming. Like the bobsled actually is a little bit, because it's based on top of this hill basically. So yeah, so far so good. And let's continue and see what we can make of it. So I'm still not too sure what I want to do with the area next to the entrance, so instead I'm just gonna keep on expanding into this part of the park. And like I always do when I have no idea what to do, I'm placing a swinging ship over the water here. Which always just works out really well, putting these things over beaches or lakes. Just fits the theme really well, and even though I know that in real life they don't really tend to be built like this usually, it's something that I really like. So I don't know if you've noticed by now, but I always tend to place these things over some kind of body of water. Anyway, aside from this, there's just going to be a small pathway over here and not much else, because to be honest, the bobsled is just using up way too much space on this part of the map. And I think I also don't want to fill in the whole map. This is one of those scenarios where you really get this sort of lake in the middle of your park, even though technically this is all just part of the sea. The land kind of is shaped around this lake in the middle of it, so I really want to build a park that is shaped very similar to that shape and just kind of have a path going around the lake and have all the attractions right next to that, but not really expand into any other territory. I just think that works out really well here. And for this area I'm actually trying a slightly different theme, which in hindsight, for some of the scenarios so far, I wish I would have done that a little bit more, because so far I'm really sticking to one certain theme in every single scenario, and I think it might be fun to mix it up a little bit as well and have some slightly themed areas, even though I'm obviously not going to get to the level of Disney when it comes to scenery. I still like to add some themed lands here and there. So this I thought would be nice to make into a sort of science fiction research base, something like that, which is a little bit more Arctic than most of Sweden, I have to admit. But given the theme, I think it works pretty well. I think it looks quite neat, and I've always wanted to try one of these things. Might as well incorporate it into the theme of this park. So this corner of the park is just going to have this general theme. That said, I'm not going to do too much with it, because this is quite a small area and there's not a lot of suitable land for flat rides and things like that. So at the moment it's just a toilet building, which is in the big hangar style building. And I still need to stop myself from saying hangar. That just, I don't know, feels much more natural to me. But yeah, in that small hangar style building there's a toilet, but that's really about it. Everything else is just setting the setting, if you will, and creating this small setup of some kind of scientific base. So yeah, quite simple, not too much to it, but I think it's nice to add an area of the game, or an area of the park, which is slightly different from the rest of the park. And that is basically also it for this whole part. I don't think I'm adding anything but scenery really in this part. I was thinking of placing a flat ride down somewhere, and actually tried doing that eventually, as you'll see in a second, but I really kind of couldn't figure out how to fit flat rides into the terrain without having to make huge modifications to it, which on the other hand I think is a huge plus when it comes to this scenario. This is one of my favorite scenarios to play so far actually, because it's a little bit more challenging when it comes to terrain and you really have to work your way around all of these slopes. The only real flat area that you get is near the beginning, on that sort of ice shelf, which I guess is what the scenario is named after, probably. But that aside, it's all just hills, so that's a bit more challenging. But what I did decide I needed in this area is some kind of star attraction, something to set this land apart. And I figured a roller coaster would be the best way to do that. And I just got the Floorless coaster through research, which I think is a more fun coaster to build than the steel coaster, which I had before this. So I'm building a Floorless coaster here. And for my inspiration, I turned mostly to Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen, Denmark, where they have a Floorless coaster called Daemonen, which I think is kind of underrated. It doesn't get as much respect as other Floorless coasters do, mostly because it's really small. But even though it's not the most thrilling coaster, I think it's absolutely phenomenal when it comes to working with the scenery around it, and especially working with a very limited space. Tivoli Gardens is a park which is in the middle of Copenhagen, right next to the central station, and really between the central station and the city hall. This is right down in the middle of the city center. Usually when you think about a theme park which is inside a city, it's not exactly within the historic core of the city, but Tivoli Gardens is something which goes back long into Copenhagen's history, which is really interesting, but because of that they are extremely tight for space. And Daemonen is the most compact coaster by B&M that I've ever seen. I don't think there's any B&M which is more compact than that is. And despite that, it has a really interesting layout where it goes through a loop, a dive loop I think, lots of twists and turns above the pathways as well, and a final 0G roll. So this layout, even though if you look at it, it looks quite a bit different, it does follow many of the similar elements to Daemonen, and I'm trying to keep this very tight, and the idea is more or less that you get this coaster which works quite well as a skyline to see in the distance from the rest of the park and from the lake especially, which I think is quite nice. Having this on the hillside as a very compact but sort of stretched out coaster works quite well, and generally I think that's just a nice sight to see if you're somewhere in the rest of the park. Even though I'm playing an isometric game, this is still one of those things that I like to keep in mind when I'm building things. So that's all for the layouts, and then for the station, I'm trying to get into the same theme as I do for the rest of this area and just go kind of sci-fi, modern-ish. Wasn't quite sure of what to do with this station, so it's just a bit of trial and error to get to a place where I like it. But it's just going to be another simple rectangular station with a gabled roof on top of it. But to add some variation to it, there are some like horizontal sides which are a little bit lower, and the middle parts of the roof, as you can see, are tilting to both sides. So it's not a completely straight, simple roof. There's a few details which at least make it a little bit more interesting than that, I think. And yeah, that is pretty much it for this area. I really wanted to add some flat rides to this as well, especially given how the motion simulator and the cinema building for the cinema flat ride look really sci-fi-ish and would work quite well with this theme of some kind of science lab out in Scandinavia, but in the end there really isn't any space for it, and I don't want to start using the rest of the island because I also still want to get to the third island, or a third land within the park, if you will, where I want to go for a slightly different theme again, so I don't want to dwell on this area for too long. And at this point, I was also running out of money. I was making money here again because I just opened the coaster, but I was kind of confused for a good while as to why I wasn't making money anymore, where before I was, and there really wasn't anything wrong with the park. I didn't have vandalism or anything like that, but I just wasn't earning as much money as I was before. That said, I opened the Floorless coaster and right away I got hundreds in profits every month again. And for a while, to try and avoid that scenario where I don't have any money to build stuff anymore, and after placing down every single tree I had to wait for a bit until I had enough money to place another one, I'm just putting the game on fast forward to get a good amount of money before I move onto building stuff again. And here again, I'm also adding some path covers, or things that cover the path that is underneath the track, which I need to do a little bit more actually still, but it's just something that I always do out of safety reasons, and it helps to add a bit of scenery to an area as well. Just works out. And yeah, that is basically just about it for the coaster. The rest of this time-lapse is just adding extra foliage and starting to move on to the next area, just to make sure that this whole land is going to transition smoothly from the different parts of the park as well. But altogether, it doesn't feel too out of place. I was really afraid that this area would feel too radically different from the rest of the park. But I think as long as you're generally using the same foliage and some similar path elements, things like that, it can still work quite well. Really the only real important thing is to transition somehow from one land to another, and I think having that small part with the pirate ship where there really isn't anything else in terms of scenery transitions well enough from this area to the next one. And then over here I'm building a bridge as the next transition, which I think works quite well as well. I'll still have to see what I'm gonna do with the next island, to be honest. I'm thinking about doing some kind of more Renaissance style Swedish architecture, so working more with stone and making it look a little bit more like architecture that you would see in the middle of the city of Stockholm. But I still need to figure out how exactly I'm going to do that. Anyway, that's it for this time lapse, so let's see how the park is doing. Well then, here we are, and the coaster is making more profits than I know what to do with, and it honestly is running pretty well. And I haven't even checked out the stats too much yet, but extreme excitement rating versus a medium intensity and low nausea is pretty good, and the decoration stat is actually already amazing. I didn't expect it to be amazing yet, but I guess the trees possibly helped quite a bit with that. And the station is made up of a lot of pieces, and really the only thing that the game checks, I think, to check for decoration stats is the amount of different scenery pieces that you're using. So that's all quite good, and I think it has a decent speed as well in terms of making it through all of the elements. So yeah, I'm really happy with this, and really it does feel very similar to Daemonen in terms of what elements it's doing with the vertical loop and the dive loop and the Immelman as well. And there's 2 helixes, which is very similar as well, and ending with a 0G roll. Everything is just in a kind of slightly different place, and there's an extra Immelman, I believe, if I can remember the layout for Daemonen well enough. But yeah, definitely feels like its own layout, just inspired by. So I'm pretty happy with this ride. I'm also really happy with the Bobsled. I don't think I showed off the stats for that one, but this one works really well as well. I wasn't expecting the Bobsled to get stats that were this good, but an excitement rating of 70 is really good, so I'm asking $12 for this one. Could possibly ask for more money, but it's working so far. And for the Floorless coaster, I'm asking for $15 to enter it, which is very steep, but hey, the guests are willing to pay this, so might as well. And then the next step is to expand into this part of the park, and maybe, hopefully, one day actually do something with this area, which is currently just a dead end. I think I won't be able to really do much with it. It's just going to be a flat ride or 2. Yeah, maybe just 1 flat ride. But we do need this area to get the staff to go to the staff building thingamajig here. Actually, God, speaking of that, I forgot to place down a staff room and a training room. Okay, I'm gonna have to do that as soon as possible. I should actually probably do that down here somewhere. That's something I need to fix. I always forget about those things. But that aside, I think the park is running quite fine. There are enough toilets and shops and stuff like that for everyone to be quite happy. And all of the guests do seem to be pretty happy. And in fact, I'm pretty well on my way to reaching the goal, because the happiness and experiences rating is pretty good. I just need to get 550 guests, and if my estimate is correct, just 1 more coaster and maybe a few more flat rides should be able to get us to 550 guests. So let's get building again. Alright, so what I decided to build is something inspired by some of the islands that you find in Stockholm, which is a city that I visited last summer, and I really liked the interaction that the city has with the water. There's lots of these islands and just waterfront areas which are absolutely beautiful, but on our way from the city center to a park called Grönalund, I probably terribly mispronounced that, but I really suck at Swedish pronunciation, so I'm sorry about that. But yeah, on our way to that park, we had to catch a ferry, and this ferry also passes by some islands with some old, I believe, sort of castles and previously used military barracks or things like that. In any case, some islands with some architecture on it that looked really cool. And I was mostly inspired by that to build this, so it's a little bit more urban and dense than some of the other parts of the park. But I was also inspired by just the overall skyline that the area of Gröna Lund has. Because as you're approaching that park, it's on the water as well, so the ferry is right next to it, and you just see these towers of the drop towers and the buildings and the roller coasters all in this super tight spot. And it just looks really cool. The view from there is absolutely amazing. So that was the general idea that I had when I wanted to get into this part of the park. Now, obviously, space is really limited here. So the only coaster type that I could, feasibly figure out a way to feature into the scenery was I think this is, the Wild Mouse coaster, which is not my favorite coaster. I'm not a big fan of how it looks, and it doesn't interact with scenery all that well, but it's really compact and it has lots of straight pieces. And I wanted to build something which would go in and out of buildings a lot and interact as much as possible with the scenery of the island. Also, please ignore the drop tower that I'm just building right now. I completely forgot that I already built a drop tower in the park before, and I'm not even sure how I didn't notice it, because I went back to check whether I already built a drop tower, and for some reason I didn't notice the previous one. It just kind of, I don't know, it was invisible to me for some reason. So I built another drop tower, and I'll be going back to the other area of the park to remove the old one and try to come up with another way to use that space, because I don't want to have the same exact ride twice. Although Gröna Lund has a lot of drop towers, some of them really good. It has a drop tower which is just pretty much a regular old launched drop tower. It has one drop tower which is really unique, and it tilts you forward, or really it tilts you downward 90 degrees before it lets you drop. So you just look straight at the ground where you're dropping from that one, and by the time that you get down to the ground, the seats kind of swing out into the side so you don't get stupid high G-forces into the harnesses. But yeah, that's an amazing ride, definitely one of my favorite drop towers that I've ever been on, if not my favorite. And then it also has a Star Flyer, which isn't quite a drop tower, but it sort of adds to the aesthetic of the park of just being a cluster of these different tower rides. I don't think I forgot any there. You mostly just see 3 towers of the park, I think. But yeah, that's the sort of aesthetic of the park, and that's what really makes it draw your attention when you're in the rest of the city, because you can see the park from quite a distance just because you see these towers. So yeah, I thought that was really cool. Wanted to do this on this island. I just forgot that I already had a drop tower in the park, so I'm gonna figure that out later. So for the rest of the scenery, I mostly built the layout of the coaster with an idea of scenery in mind, as you might be able to tell because the layout is really weird. I just based the layout on how I wanted the buildings to be and how I wanted the layout to sort of weave in and out of these buildings. So it's a very simple general shape, I would say. Just one interior plaza with a bunch of buildings around it, sort of castle-like, in a sense that lots of the buildings have slightly different colors and textures, but they all form a single coherent wall around this middle square, which is, I guess, something typical of castles because they tend to be built across different ages. So everything's a little bit different, but hopefully it should all come together to form one nice building, and I hope that's not going to fail. I also like the tower here just because for me every big building needs at least one spire or dome or something that's taller than the rest of the building that sort of draws your attention, and I think putting this tower on the top of the lift hill is a pretty cliched and tried and true method of integrating coasters into scenery. For me, Black Mamba in Phantasialand comes to mind, but it works really well, so just wanted to put that out there. And just to keep the whole Swedish theme, because in the end I'm still trying to base this as much as possible on Swedish architecture. There's a little red Swedish house in here as well. But all of the colors and the textures of the rest of the buildings are loosely based on what you see in the city center of Stockholm. So yeah, that's basically what inspired me. I also had to research the scenery at this point, I believe, because I didn't start out with the brick walls, but I really wanted to use those. Because you might be able to tell that the buildings that I've built so far are just made out of regular old plaster, which isn't too bad, but they're kind of built to be brick buildings, so for some of the other buildings I do want to get into that, so I had to research some scenery at this point. It's not too big of an issue because I'm already earning way more money than I even know what to do with, so I honestly just poured $1,000 into research every month at this point, which ends up going really quickly. I think just in general, research is something which is quite crucial in the earlier stages of the scenarios, and really something that you have to carefully balance out your budget for. But as soon as you start making some good profits, you know, the research costs don't scale up with the growth of the rest of the park, so it just gets easier and easier to get research the further you are into the scenario, which is making it a little bit more easy to get into more different rides and scenery types the later into the scenario you get. I'm not even sure if this is a criticism or just an overall, you know, a positive thing for me. It's just something that I've noticed and something to keep in mind, I suppose. Anyway, moving on, we've got the station, not too spectacular here. All of these buildings on their own are just really simple. I'm trying to just make sure that altogether they work well. But really, the buildings themselves I'm not detailing or making too spectacular. They really just come out. They're supposed to fit into the bigger picture, I suppose. And finally, here's a small entrance building for the queue, because I keep messing up on the queues and not making them stand out enough. But with this, I think this is a decent entrance to the queue, although maybe I should have put a sign out front. Not entirely sure, maybe in real life that would be a thing. But given that this is Parkitect and you automatically get these sort of signs on the queue paths, that sign doesn't work as well with building walls. So I decided to have the queue sort of start inside the building instead of having the sign right out front. Not too sure how much I like that, but I think looking at the building, it works a little bit better. And then there's a little bit more detailing in some of the awnings and things like that. I didn't actually talk about the drop tower itself, but one of the reasons why I decided to keep this drop tower rather than the one that's in the other part of the park is because I did add some decorations to this, which is something which I think is very fun and something which you can always just try. Just put some roof pieces and decoration pieces on top of your drop towers or observation towers or things like that. It's a pretty easy way to incorporate them into a theme and to dress them up a little bit more. And it's something which happens in real life as well. I remember that most recently, Hansa Park has revealed their newest drop tower, which has this sort of castle element on top of the drop tower. I'm not sure how much of a fan I am of it. It looks a little bit cheap, to be honest, and I definitely think they could have built something better if maybe they had more budget allocation or whatever. But the idea of, you know, putting extra scenery on top of rides, I think is really fun, and there aren't any clearance issues in this game. Like in Roller Coaster Tycoon, you could never do this because it wouldn't allow you to put scenery on top of rides. But as long as the clearance is fine, really, I think it's a fun way to add your own flair to flat rides. So yeah, that is basically all of the buildings and really most of the scenery of the island. At this point, I was recording in the middle of the night and I really wanted to go to sleep, so I went back the next day to continue adding some more decorations. I really kept the middle square empty because I wasn't sure what to do with it, and I ended up just filling it with a small interior garden. It's not the best thing in the world, but I think it works better than just having paths there. Just having the foliage in the center is quite nice, I think. It's a bit of a French garden touch, I suppose. And I'm not sure how Scandinavian it is, but given that so many European countries have sort of imitated these French style symmetric gardens. I think it works quite alright. Oh, and then there's the tower, which is there for little other reason than just to provide a little arch for the coaster to go through. Because head choppers. Head choppers are always fun, and I think in real life this ride would be full of them. I also need to give a shout out to a ride called Gesenkte Sau, which I also probably butchered the name of, but it's a Gerstlauer bobsled coaster in a park called Tripsdrill, which is a park that I've talked about before in some of my videos, and I think actually I was sort of inspired by it on my first episode of Parkitect, but I can't remember exactly anymore. But yeah, it's a very charming park in southern Germany. Looks really cool, and the bobsled coaster, which can be a bit confusing, but a Gerstlauer bobsled coaster like Gesenkte Sau isn't a traditional bobsled, as in one that swings on a big track, but rather it's like a wild mouse with banked curves and just more advanced elements in general. But yeah, that ride I think is really amazing because it has some really cool interaction with some scenery. There's a castle around that area, which is where the coaster kind of goes through it and interacts with it, and I just think that whole concept of using a bobsled coaster to get some sort of scenery interaction with the coaster is quite nice, because these coasters have lots of different parts. They'll have the sections where they're airtime hills, they'll have sections where they're focused on these hairpin turns that wild mouses are famous for, and there are sections with curves, and they all kind of lend themselves to different kinds of scenery. So yeah, I was sort of inspired by that ride also to build my wild mouse coaster here. Anyway, moving on to the start of the park, which I still hadn't finished at this point. I decided to remove the drop tower and put my faith into research, because I didn't have a drop tower to replace it with, and I just clicked on research in hopes of getting another drop tower, and I did, which is pretty awesome. And better yet, this is the exact drop tower that they have in Grönalund. So this is the one that tilts you 90 degrees and then you fly face down to the ground, which is absolutely amazing. These things are really fun. Even though the one in Grönalund isn't that tall, it's really much more thrilling than taller drop rides, I think, just because you're looking straight down. And not just because you're looking straight down, for me also what really helps the experience is to know that you're only held there by the restraints. Sitting in a seat definitely feels a little bit more safe than just being held back from certain death by a little restraint that's over your shoulders. So yeah, great ride, and I decided to finish up the park with a chair swing, because I didn't have that yet. I definitely checked to make sure I didn't have 2 chair swings, and it just rounds up the roster of rides in the park quite well. And yeah, that is basically it for this park, so let's take one last look at it and see how it looks. Alright, so here's the final land of the park, which I really wasn't too sure about in the beginning, but in the end I really like it the most out of any part of the park. So yeah, really happy with this. I think the ride isn't that great, but given that it is a wild mouse ride, which is pretty difficult to incorporate into scenery like this, I think it works out quite well, and even the stats on it aren't too bad either. So the rest of this island is really just quite simple. We've got the drop tower and the Ferris wheel, but really the main focus is on all of the scenery here. And then the sort of sci-fi land with the sort of research facilities and stuff like that, I think work well with the theme of the coaster as well. This is something that I haven't really pointed out so far, but I really feel like certain coasters tend to work better with certain kinds of themes. And this coaster being kind of high-tech, like a Floorless B&M coaster, I think that just works really well with the sci-fi theme. I wouldn't be putting a wooden coaster in a sci-fi theme anytime soon, for instance. So yeah, I like this area as well. And then we've got the starting area with the more sort of traditional Swedish look to it, with all of these red houses, which I think work out quite well in the end as well. So yeah, altogether I'm quite happy with the park, although I do have to say the frame rate has dropped a little bit more than the scenarios so far. I can definitely notice it by the end. It's of course a little bit worse since I got way more guests in the park, since the guest goal is higher, and also I'm recording right now, but still, it's something that I noticed as well, and I'll just point it out here. I'll try not to come back to it in the future too much. But while it's not been much of an issue while I'm building stuff, especially when you're just zoomed in on a particular area, it's noticeable when you're zoomed out, when the park is all finished and all the guests are walking around. But yeah, as a general conclusion, I don't want to leave it there. I'm really quite happy with this park. It's not my favorite so far, but I actually really like the scenario itself. I really wasn't expecting to like it this much. Of course, I've played it before, but just in general, I never really took it to the final objective. I only sort of messed around in the starting area, but building in the whole park kind of made me realize how well this map works. You know, it's just another map that with a little bit of effort you can fill in the whole map in, but it's not like you leave anything out. It's not like you have to go out of your way to fill any spaces up, and you also don't really run out of space. So I think it's good for a sort of intermediate scenario, and having the sort of cold climate is a nice change from all of the tropical vibes that we get in the other scenarios in this part of the game. So yeah, altogether, I'm happy with this, and I'm gonna miss out on the animation for getting the trophy because I already went to that off camera, but we got this little house which is from the entrance area, I believe, and the next scenario is Biscayne Beach over here. We already had that, but then there's Happy Co Harbor on this side, which I've heard is pretty difficult, but then again, so is Biscayne Beach. Anyway, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in Batavia K.